Postdoctoral Fellow at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Development. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh has launched his second book, The New Apartheid. In it, he explores the structure of systemic racial oppression and grapples with the question to which it continues to thrive, even within South Africa's democratic dispensation. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh joins me now for more on the story. Sizwe, good evening to you, and congratulations on, the launch of your second book that it is, and a project, at least just listening to some of the conversations that you've been having, you sound a lot more proud of than the first book that you had penned. Tell me about what makes this one different from the first one, and just the journey that you believe you've been on.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Sis Cathy, and really glad to see you back after your COVID ordeal, so welcome back. This book, I think, reflects ways that I've tried to grow as a scholar and ways that I've tried to grow as a writer, and those two things aren't necessarily always the same. There are many great scholars who aren't great writers and vice versa, but in the intervening period between my first book and this book, I really sharpened my craft as a researcher, acquiring my PhD, and I really tried to put all that I learned in that PhD, even though it wasn't related to this current book, into the research of this book. And I hope readers will find that, in distinction to many books out that reflect on current affairs, this is a work of scholarship and deep research, as well as a work of commentary on South Africa's deep crisis as I see it.
I did get that sense. I tried to read it in my last week of recovery, and I wasn't sure whether it was the COVID brain fog or if I was just, too slow to kind of catch up with it. I had to have my dictionary quite close to me. What made it difficult for you to actually put this book together as you've reflected again in other media?
That's good. I must say I admire your courage taking on COVID and this book at the same time. That's quite the. I'd like to say the book played a role in your recovery as well, but we'll see what you think of that. I think the reason this book was so difficult to write, as I say in the book, was that I was constantly confronting apartheid for real this time. And what I realized as I researched this book and tried to disentangle, in other words, pick apart apartheid's effects and imprints on our society today, what I realized is that we don't like to look at apartheid. It's simultaneously omnipresent and invisible. In other words, it's all around us, but we don't speak its name and we don't look at it in the eye. And for 3 years, really, I had to look at it in the eye, think about it deeply. And you can't fail to appreciate the scale of the apartheid project and the way that it has tyrannized and destroyed lives, and not just in the past, but also in the present. And the hardest thing was realizing that this project is still alive. It has reinvented itself. And the plan was always for apartheid to have a life after democracy, and that was hard to come to terms with.
And that's one of the big questions that you really grapple with within the book, right? What are the ways in which apartheid has embedded itself within even democratic society and the systems that exist to date? Firstly, Sizwe, are there parameters within which you are working? Because it is such a broad question, and depending on which sector of our society you're looking at, you're going to come up with different answers, and some may not necessarily point to the level of embedding perhaps that you're arguing about in this book.
I think so, and I like the way you put it, that apartheid has become embedded in our society. Yes, certainly. In fact, one of the difficulties I came up against as I tried to conceptualize this project and this book was, how can I make an argument that touches on South African history, the South African present, and even looks towards a new South African future, while confining it to the limits of one book, and also while making it readable and making it exciting and engaging, even if a bit challenging at times. And what I quickly realized was that I couldn't do it all, and I think there may be hopefully a generation of scholars who look back on this work. At least that was my hope and my ambition when I was writing it, that take it in different directions. But I tried to confine the work in the main chapters to 5 areas of South African life, to try and reveal the argument in people's real lives in places like law, technology, wealth, criminal punishment. And so the chapters in the book are really a snapshot and a glimpse into the new apartheid. But I think it's a much deeper and a bigger crisis, and one that we all need to hopefully reflect on and contribute towards. And this was my first opening salvo for what I hope will become a national debate about the way apartheid continues to live, even though nobody's actually behind the steering wheel.
Would we have a new apartheid, as you argue in this book, if the government had done a better job of implementing its own policies of reform? So this inability of apartheid, as it were, is it born out of the inability of government to do what it said it would do? Or would we remain in the state even if every policy was implemented to 100%?
Well, it's been interesting to me as I've watched the debate about the book unfold that some people, glancing at the title, have assumed that because I'm invoking apartheid, I'm thereby exonerating or letting off the hook the ANC government. But I think those who do read the book will see that nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, implicit in the title, The New Apartheid, is a damning critique on the ANC government. Because if I'm saying that apartheid has persisted, I'm implicitly saying that the ANC has failed rather spectacularly to address the legacy of apartheid. And so the book launches a very fundamental critique on the ANC, not looking at the headlines and the issues which happen to be hogging media attention at the moment, but looking at what the ANC has actually been able to achieve in nearly 3 decades, nearly half the time the National Party was in power. And ultimately, I find that it's been essentially a mob of mediocrity. But having said that, I think we can often be too quick to jump to criticize the government, to look at the questions that are stealing headlines, without taking a step back and looking at the structural malaise. And so what I also do in the book is say, even if we did have a benign and a benevolent government, which we surely don't, we would still be in a major structural crisis if we didn't address the other aspects of apartheid, which live beyond the state and beyond the government, in our private lives, in our private bank accounts, in our private gated communities, within the economy. And so what we have is a massive and a monumental task on our hands. And I think in many ways we've forgotten how big the task is to uproot apartheid, not just in the state sphere, but in every sphere of life. And the project is one that may well be multi-generational. And sadly, the ANC has merely scratched the surface, if that, of the apartheid project. And in fact, become integrated into that project at times.
One of the things that I've also quite enjoyed is that you've been speaking quite openly about what this book is not about. And to me, that suggests that there is a fair level of self-critique that you also take on in having done this work. And I think it's important for you to also speak about that on this platform, so that whoever goes to buy the book understands the context in which you have written it and understands why you believe this is a book for specifically this moment that we are in.
Well, absolutely. And I think the one thing I have clarified just recently now in our conversation is that this book is not an exoneration of the ANC, anything but. But it's also important for me to concede that South Africa is not the same as it was before 1994. And I'm not completely disavowing everything that's happened since 1994. The constitutional era has been an important and advance. The establishment of a constitutional democracy is important, and the conferral or the giving of the vote to citizens above the age of 18 is certainly an advance. The problem I have in the book is not that those aren't advances, but that we tend to over-dramatize the so-called transition that our country has been through. And when we do that, we do 2 things. We firstly limit our imaginations because we imagine that this particular South Africa, this version of South Africa that we live in, is the best of all possible versions. But we also don't see the resemblances between this moment and the apartheid past. And I don't think anyone looking back on our society, say 100 years from now, will fail to see the imprint of apartheid on our society. So why can't we who live through this moment see it? And that's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring apartheid back into the discourse because it so permeates our society, but we so refuse to look it in the face.
In the end, Sizwe, part of what you have done is that you're arguing for a reimagination, as it were, of this country and the kind of political landscape that we could have and the possibility. Effectively, you're challenging the reader to put aside what exists and imagine if you're given an opportunity to write something on a blank canvas, you know, what that could be. What informs your process in terms of reimagining what this country could look like?
Well, there's a brilliant economist working at the London School of Economics at the moment called Minouche Shafik, and she says something which I think is particularly profound for South Africa at the moment, and that is that sometimes to solve a big problem, you don't make the problem smaller, you actually make it bigger. And I think what we've done in South Africa over the last 3 years is narrowed the problem and focused on this issue and then turned to another particular issue without taking a step back and looking at the scale of the problem which confronts us. And I think we need to make the problem bigger, realize its monumental scale, not so that we can sit back and lament that we're in a crisis, but so that we can go about the real work of reimagining what South Africa could look like if we really ambitiously tackled the new apartheid in all its complexity. And so what I'm calling for people to do is to hold off for a moment on the self-congratulation of the last 3 decades. Take a look around us, and for those who happen to be in spaces of privilege, take a look outside that bubble and think how we might be able to reimagine this entire republic. It's not going to be one policy or even a change of government that's going to get us out of this malaise. It's going to be a multi-generational, deep-seated vision to reimagine this country beyond its current constraints. And we can't be held back just because 3 decades ago, a group of people thought that this was the best version of South Africa. I believe we can have a second democratic republic, which consolidates the gains of the first, but transcends its limitations. And that's what we should be grasping towards in the next decades ahead.
All right, Sizwe, just before I let you go, who should buy this book and where can people get it?
This book is available everywhere, and I'm glad to say it's one of the best-selling books in South Africa at the moment, which has surprised me. You can also buy a signed copy on my website, sizwempofu-walsh.com. The person who I'd really love to read this book is a person, no matter their age, race, gender, who feels disillusioned with where South Africa finds itself, but also believes that something fundamentally different, new, creative, and exciting is possible, and wants now to educate themselves on both the crisis, but also the early imagination on what the solution to that crisis might look like.
All right, Sizwe, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh is a postdoctoral fellow, and he is with WISER at Wits University. I certainly encourage you to get that book. Like I said, do pull your dictionaries closer. It is also an incredible contribution to his scholarly work as well. And that will come out a lot in the book. You'll get to see it once you actually begin to dig in.